In September 2010, a woman's body was discovered in a small, cluttered apartment in Torquay, England. She had died alone. There were no relatives to claim her, no friends to mourn her passing, and no one who seemed to know anything about her life. The local authorities assumed she was just another forgotten elderly woman, perhaps mentally ill, certainly poor, and definitely insignificant. They prepared to give her a pauper's funeral, a simple cremation with no ceremony, no flowers, and no mourners. But then someone decided to search her apartment more thoroughly, and what they found changed everything. Hidden among the clutter, tucked away in drawers and boxes, were documents, photographs, and medals that told a story so extraordinary, so incredible, that it seemed like fiction. There was a Croix de Guerre, the French medal for military bravery. There was documentation from the British Special Operations Executive. There were faded photographs of a young woman in wartime Britain. This forgotten, lonely woman who died in obscurity was Eileen Nearne, one of the most courageous spies of World War II, a woman who had been captured by the Gestapo, tortured repeatedly, sent to a Nazi concentration camp, and yet never once betrayed her fellow agents or her country. This is her story, and it deserves to be told. Before we continue with this incredible story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves true stories of courage and survival. Your support helps us bring more stories like this one to life. Among the many unsung heroes of World War II, there is one story that stands out, a story of resilience, survival, and defiance against unimaginable odds. It's the story of Eileen Nearne, a British spy who was part of the Special Operations Executive, SOE, the secret organization tasked with sabotage and espionage behind enemy lines. Eileen's mission was to aid the French resistance in their fight against Nazi forces, but what followed would push her to her physical and emotional limits. This is her tale, the story of a woman who never broke, even in the face of unimaginable pain and torture. Eileen Nearne was born on March 15, 1921, in London, but her family moved to France when she was just a young girl. Her father was English, and her mother was Spanish, and they settled in a comfortable life in France, where Eileen and her siblings grew up speaking multiple languages fluently. This multilingual upbringing would later prove to be the key to her remarkable wartime career. But as a child, Eileen had no idea what fate had in store for her. She was described as shy, quiet, and somewhat reserved, the opposite of what you might expect from someone who would later become one of Britain's most fearless secret agents. The Nearne family lived peacefully in France for years, but everything changed in 1940 when Nazi Germany invaded. The German army swept through France with terrifying speed, and suddenly the Nearne family found themselves living under enemy occupation. For many families, this meant keeping their heads down and trying to survive, but the Nearne children were made of different stuff. Eileen's older sister, Jacqueline, was already developing a fierce hatred of the Nazi occupiers, and Eileen shared her sister's feelings. They watched as their neighbors were persecuted, as Jewish families were rounded up and taken away, and as the freedom they had known all their lives was crushed under the boot of fascism. The family made the dangerous decision to escape from occupied France and make their way to Britain. This was no simple journey. They had to cross through Spain, navigating a country that was officially neutral, but deeply sympathetic to fascism. They risked arrest at every checkpoint, discovery at every border. But eventually, after weeks of tension and fear, they made it to Britain, arriving in London in 1942. They were safe, but safety wasn't enough for Eileen and Jacqueline Nearne. They wanted to fight back. Both sisters volunteered for the war effort, but it was Jacqueline who first came to the attention of the Special Operations Executive. The SOE was one of Britain's most secret organizations, created by Winston Churchill with the famous instruction to set Europe ablaze. The SOE's mission was to conduct espionage, sabotage, and reconnaissance in occupied Europe, and they desperately needed agents who could speak fluent French and blend in with the local population. Jacqueline Nearne was exactly what they were looking for, and she was recruited, trained, and sent to France in 1943, where she worked as a courier for a resistance network. Eileen watched her sister disappear into the shadow world of espionage, and she was determined to follow. She was only 22 years old, small in stature, and still possessed of that quiet, reserved personality that had defined her childhood. But beneath that shy exterior was a core of steel that the SOE would soon discover. She applied to join the organization, and after extensive interviews and background checks, she was accepted for training. The training that SOE agents underwent was brutal and comprehensive. Eileen learned how to use weapons, how to kill silently, how to use explosives, how to pick locks, and how to resist interrogation. She trained in the Scottish Highlands, where the harsh conditions were designed to break anyone who wasn't completely committed. She learned how to parachute from aircraft, how to use a radio transmitter, and how to create and use codes that would allow her to communicate with London without the Germans intercepting her messages. Radio operators were perhaps the most important and most dangerous role in the SOE. They were the lifeline between the resistance networks in France and the controllers back in Britain. Without them, the resistance would be blind and deaf, unable to coordinate their activities or receive instruction from London. But being a radio operator was also incredibly dangerous. Every time an operator transmitted a message, they risked detection by the German direction-finding equipment. The Germans had mobile units that could triangulate the position of a transmitter within minutes, and they were constantly hunting for SOE radio operators. The average life expectancy of a radio operator in occupied France was just 6 weeks. Eileen knew this. She knew that she was volunteering for what was essentially a suicide mission, and she did it anyway. On March 2nd, 1944, Eileen Nearne was flown from IAF Tempsford in a small Lysander aircraft and landed secretly in occupied France. She was given the code name Rose, and she was assigned to work with Resistance Network in Paris. Her cover story was that she was Jacqueline Duterte, a French shopgirl. She carried false identity papers, and she dressed and acted like any other young French woman. But hidden in her apartment was a suitcase containing a radio transmitter, and every few days, she would set it up, string out the antenna, and tap out coded messages to London. The work was terrifying. Every transmission was a gamble with her life. She would sit in front of the radio, headphones clamped over her ears, fingers tapping out Morse code, knowing that German detection vans might be circling her neighborhood at that very moment. She had to keep moving, never transmitting from the same location too many times, always staying one step ahead of the hunters. And she had to do all this while maintaining her cover as an ordinary French woman, shopping for groceries, chatting with neighbors, and giving no indication that she was anything other than what she appeared to be. For months, Eileen successfully transmitted messages back to London. She was providing vital intelligence about German troop movements, helping to coordinate sabotage operations, and preparing the ground for the D-Day landings that were coming. The invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, changed everything. Suddenly, the resistance networks were activated for maximum disruption, and Eileen's work became even more critical and even more dangerous. The Germans knew that an invasion was underway, and they redoubled their efforts to root out the resistance. In July 1944, the nightmare that every SOE agent dreaded finally happened. Eileen was in the middle of a transmission when there was a hammering at the door. The Gestapo had found her. There was no time to destroy the radio or the code books. German soldiers burst into the room and arrested her. She was taken to Gestapo headquarters in Paris, and the torture began. The Gestapo were experts at breaking people. They had refined their techniques over years of practice, and they knew exactly how to inflict maximum pain while keeping their victims alive and conscious. Eileen was beaten. She was subjected to water torture, held underwater until she was on the edge of drowning, then pulled back and questioned over and over again. They wanted to know the names of her contacts. They wanted to know the locations of other agents. They wanted her codes, her schedules, her networks. They wanted everything. But Eileen Nearne refused a break. Despite the agony, despite the terror, she told them nothing of value. She stuck to a cover story that she had prepared in advance. She told them that she was just a simple French woman who had been forced to send messages by a man she barely knew. She pretended to be naive and ignorant, just a foolish girl who had gotten in over her head. The Gestapo didn't believe her at first. They continued the torture, certain that eventually she would crack. Everyone cracked eventually, they believed, but Eileen didn't. This wasn't just physical courage, although that was certainly part of it. It was also a demonstration of incredible mental strength and discipline. Eileen had been trained to resist interrogation, and she applied that training with everything she had. She knew that if she gave up even one piece of real information, it could lead to the arrest and execution of other agents. She knew that her silence was quite literally the difference between life and death for her fellow operatives, and so she stayed silent. After weeks of torture, The Gestapo finally concluded that she was telling the truth, that she really was just a naive girl who had been exploited by the resistance. They had broken her physically, but they had not broken her spirit, and they had not extracted any useful intelligence. It was a victory, although Eileen must have known that her ordeal was far from over. In August 1944, Eileen was transported to Germany. Paris was about to be liberated by Allied forces, and the Gestapo was evacuating its prisoners. Eileen was loaded onto a cattle car with dozens of other prisoners and sent east of Ravensbrück, the notorious Nazi concentration camp for women. Ravensbrück was a place of unspeakable horror. Prisoners were worked to death, starved, subjected to medical experiments, and executed. The conditions were designed to strip away every ounce of humanity, to reduce the prisoners to animals, and then to kill them. Eileen arrived at Ravensbrück and was immediately set to work as a slave laborer. The guards were brutal, the food was almost non-existent, and disease was rampant. Prisoners died every day, their bodies stacked like cordwood before being disposed of in the crematorium. Eileen watched women around her give up hope and die. She watched as the strong became weak and the weak simply ceased to exist. But still, she refused to give in. From Ravensbrück, Eileen was transferred to a labor camp at Markkleeberg, near Leipzig. Here, prisoners were forced to work in an aircraft factory, assembling components for German warplanes. The work was exhausting, the hours were endless, and the brutality of the guards never let up. Eileen was starving. She was sick, and she was far from home with no idea if rescue would ever come. The war was clearly turning against Germany, as everyone could hear the Allied bombers flying overhead day and night. But the end seemed impossibly far away. As the Allied forces closed in on Germany from both east and west, the Nazis began to evacuate the labor camps. They didn't want their prisoners to be liberated. They either wanted to use them as slave labor until the very last moment, or they wanted to eliminate them so that there would be no witnesses to their crimes. In April 1945, Eileen and the other prisoners at Markkleeberg were forced to march west, away from the advancing Soviet army. This was one of the infamous death marches that killed thousands of concentration camp prisoners in the final weeks of the war. The prisoners marched for days with almost no food or water. Those who fell behind were shot. Those who collapsed from exhaustion were left to die by the roadside. The guards were desperate and vicious, taking out their frustration on the helpless prisoners. But Eileen saw her chance. In the chaos and confusion of the march, as the guards' attention was divided and the organization of the column began to break down, she made her move. Along with 2 French women she had befriended, Eileen slipped away from the column and hid in a forest. They waited, hearts pounding, expecting at any moment to hear the shouts of guards or the crack of gunfire. But no one came after them. The column marched on without them, and the 3 women were alone in the German forest, free but in terrible danger. They were deep inside enemy territory, starving, exhausted, and weak. They had no papers, no food, and no idea how to find safety. For days, they wandered through the forest and countryside, hiding during the day and moving at night. They scavenged for food, eating whatever they could find. They were constantly afraid of being recaptured, and Eileen knew that if the SS found them, there would be no mercy. Escaped prisoners were shot on sight, no questions asked. But luck was finally on their side. The 3 women stumbled upon a group of German soldiers who wanted nothing to do with the war anymore. Germany was collapsing, and these soldiers knew it. They pointed the women in the direction of the American lines and let them go. After more days of walking, Eileen and her companions finally reached Allied forces. They were free. Eileen Nearne was eventually returned to Britain, where she was debriefed by the SOE. She told them everything that had happened, the capture, the torture, the concentration camps, and the escape. She was awarded the Croix de Guerre by France and the Member of the Order of the British Empire by Britain. She was recognized as a hero, a woman who had risked everything and endured unimaginable suffering for the cause of freedom. But the story doesn't end there, and what comes next is perhaps the most tragic part of all. After the war, Eileen found it almost impossible to adjust to normal life. She had seen too much, suffered too much, and been changed too fundamentally by her experiences. She tried various jobs but couldn't settle. She became increasingly reclusive, withdrawing from social contact and living a solitary existence. The sister she had followed into the SOE, Jacqueline, had survived the war and tried to help, but Eileen pushed her away. She pushed everyone away. Decades passed. The war faded from public memory, and the heroes of that conflict grew old and died. Eileen moved to Torquay, a seaside town on the English coast, and lived alone in a small apartment. Her neighbors thought she was strange, perhaps suffering from mental illness. Some of them were even a little afraid of her. No one knew about her past. No one knew that this frail, eccentric old woman had once been one of Britain's bravest spies. Eileen died in September 2010, at the age of 89. When her body was discovered, the local council prepared to give her a pauper's funeral. They assumed she was nobody, just another lonely death in a country full of lonely deaths. But then a housing official searching her apartment found the medals, the documents, and the photographs. He realized that this was no ordinary woman. He contacted the media, and suddenly, the world learned the story of Eileen Nearne. The reaction was extraordinary. Veterans' organizations protested the plans for a pauper's funeral. The French and British governments expressed their admiration for her service. People who had never met her donated money to ensure she would have a proper burial. In the end, Eileen Nearne was given a military funeral with full honors. Representatives of the British and French military attended. The local community turned out in force to pay their respects to a woman they had never known, but who had given so much for their freedom. The story of Eileen Nearne raises profound questions about heroism, memory, and the price of courage. She was willing to give her life for her country, and in many ways, she did. The torture and the concentration camps broke something inside her that could never be fully repaired. The shy, quiet girl who went to war came back as a damaged woman who could never find peace. She spent her final decades alone, haunted by memories that she could never share. But her silence under torture saved lives. Her refusal to break meant that other agents survived the war. Her courage helped to liberate France and defeat one of the most evil regimes in human history. These are not small things. These are accomplishments that deserve to be remembered and honored. There is something deeply wrong with a world that allows its heroes to die forgotten and alone. Eileen Nearne deserved better than the lonely death she received. She deserved recognition, gratitude, and care. Instead, she got decades of solitude in a body that lay undiscovered for days. We failed her, just as we fail so many of our veterans and heroes. But perhaps it's not too late to learn from her story. Perhaps we can look at the elderly people in our communities, the quiet ones, the strange ones, the ones who seem to have no one, and wonder what stories they might be carrying. Perhaps we can reach out to them, befriend them, and show them that they are not forgotten. Perhaps we can honor the memory of Eileen Nearne by treating others with the kindness and respect that she deserved but never received. Eileen Nearne's story is ultimately a story about the human spirit. It's about the incredible reserves of strength that ordinary people can discover when they are pushed to the absolute limit. It's about the choice that every person faces when confronted with unimaginable pressure, the choice between breaking and standing firm. And it's about the cost of courage, the price that heroes pay for their bravery. Some people are born heroes, but most heroes are made by circumstance. Eileen Nearne was a shy, quiet girl who became a fearless spy because the world demanded it of her. She didn't seek out danger or glory. She simply saw what needed to be done and did it, regardless of the personal cost. That is perhaps the truest form of courage there is. When the Gestapo tortured her, they expected her to break. They had broken countless others. They knew all the techniques, all the pressure points, all the ways to make a person betray everything they held dear. But they didn't understand what they were dealing with. They didn't understand that this small, quiet woman had a will of iron and a commitment to her cause that no amount of pain could shake. Every minute of silence was a victory. Every hour that passed without betraying her comrades was another life saved. Eileen understood this with perfect clarity, even through the fog of pain and terror. She knew exactly what was at stake, and she refused to fail. Not for herself, not really, because her fate was already sealed from the moment of her capture, but for the others, for the agents still in the field, for the French civilians who were risking everything to resist the occupation, for the cause of freedom itself. That's the thing about true heroes. They don't think about themselves. They think about others. They think about the mission. They think about what's right. And they find the strength to endure anything because giving up is simply not an option. Eileen Nearne survived the war, but in some ways, she never really came home. The woman who walked out of that German forest in 1945 was not the same person who had parachuted into France a little over a year earlier. The torture, the camps, and the constant proximity to death had changed her fundamentally. She carried those scars for the rest of her life, invisible to the outside world but impossible to escape. We don't talk enough about what war does to the people who fight it. We celebrate their victories, we honor their bravery, and then we expect them to return to normal life as if nothing had happened. But that's not how it works. The things that Eileen saw and experienced were beyond the capacity of normal life to process or heal. She did the best she could, but she was fighting a battle that she could never win, a battle against her own memories. In the end, Eileen Nearne found peace only in death. It's a melancholy ending to a heroic story, but perhaps there's comfort in knowing that her sacrifice is finally being recognized. Today, her name is known. Her story is told. She is remembered as what she truly was, one of the bravest women of her generation, a hero who never broke, no matter what the enemy did to her. The story of Eileen Nearne should never be forgotten. It should be taught in schools, told to children, and remembered by every generation that enjoys the freedom that she helped to secure. We owe her that much. We owe her so much more than we can ever repay. But the best way to honor her memory is not with words or ceremonies. It's by living up to the values she embodied: courage, commitment, sacrifice, loyalty to something greater than ourselves. These are the qualities that made Eileen Nearne a hero, and they are the qualities that the world still desperately needs. The next time you feel like giving up, remember Eileen Nearne. Remember the torture chambers of the Gestapo. Remember the horrors of Ravensbrück. Remember the death march through the German forest. And remember that she never broke. If she could endure all of that and still hold on to what mattered most, then surely we can find the strength to face our own challenges, whatever they may be. Eileen Nearne was a spy who never broke, a woman who proved that the human spirit is stronger than any torture, any prison, any attempt to crush it. She was a hero in the truest sense of the word. And now, finally, the world knows her name.